Chapter 29, the Reformation. So the Roman Catholic Church did not really adjust to the changing times in the 15th and 16th centuries. So many people started to call for change because things like the Black Death and some of the corruption scandals and things like the Pope being split into two different places. So people did start calling for some reforms. So church leaders, though, they didn't like that criticism, and a lot of them refused to change. So that leads us to this guy, Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther was a monk and a scholar. He was pretty intensely Catholic, and he struggled, however, though, to figure out how he would be judged and how other people would be judged by God. So he studied the New Testament and believed that eventually, when he realized this one phrase, that faith was all that was needed for salvation, not good works like the Catholic Church taught, and faith, just faith. So Pope Leo X, that's one of the Medici popes, he sent monks out to sell indulgences, and those are documents that free people from their past sins that we've talked about a bit, and so he could rebuild St. Peter's Church in Rome. And Luther objected to these things and some other practices too, so he posted these 95 statements of belief, which were called the 95 Theses, on the door of the castle church at Wittenberg. And that's an example right over here of what an indulgence actually looked like. So Luther, in addition to objecting about indulgences, argued that popes could make mistakes, that the only true guide to religious truth was the Bible, and that every Christian should be able to read the Bible and pray without a priest. And each of these things really upset the Pope and the Catholic Church at the time, because if you can suddenly have someone being in charge, or someone being able to actually pray by themselves, they don't need the church quite as much. And if people can read the Bible, then they don't need someone to tell them what to do. And certainly indulgences was a way of cutting in on the money. And so this was a huge deal. And Pope Leo X, he excommunicated Luther and said the German Emperor Charles V should try him as a heretic, and that's basically someone who holds different beliefs than the accepted church. Now, Charles needed the support of other princes, and some of them supported Luther, so he promised that there would be a fair trial, but secretly he promised the Pope that Martin Luther would be convicted. He was convicted, but he was able to escape and without being harmed. And he lived for a few more years, and didn't really realize probably the storm that he set in motion. So a new religion in terms of northern Germany, if you look here, this pink area here, that ends up being Lutheran, and this yellow area is Catholic. Groups left the Roman Catholic Church to form the Lutheran Church, and Charles V tried to defeat the princes that supported Luther, but was unable to do so, and that led to something eventually called the Peace of Augsburg, which said that people could be both Roman Catholics and Lutherans within the German area, the Holy Roman Empire. So, but this Peace of Augsburg, it kept the peace for about 50 years. While this all going on, Luther's ideas spread to other areas as well. In Switzerland, preachers and merchants set up what were called the Reformed churches, and reformed as in they were reformed churches. Now, Protestant church leaders were called ministers, and this guy here, Ulrich Zwingli, he helped Switzerland completely break with the Catholic Church, and not even try to attempt to sort of make amends with the Catholic Church or change it, just split it away. And he was killed in battle, but the Protestant Church became firmly established in Switzerland by the time, well, soon after his death or during his lifetime as well. So. Now, John Calvin, again, Switzerland ends up being this point in Europe where this is an important area of the Reformation. So, in Switzerland, in Geneva, a guy named John Calvin set up the first church governed by a council of ministers. And Calvin believed in predestination, that people were going to heaven or hell depending upon whether when they were born, not so much what they did in life. And Calvin also believed that God knew all the past, the present, and the future, and controlled it all. He believed that ministers had the right to interpret the Bible, that they didn't need to listen to other people that were above them necessarily. Now, Calvin wrote many books that helped guide Protestants, and Geneva passed laws that really were strict and enforced behavioral norms. And young men came to Geneva, and they spread the religion to different areas here. So here we have Geneva, it spreads it. Presbyterianism comes up here, Huguenots in France, and other areas as well, where really it spreads out. And Lutheranism coming up here, which isn't exactly related to Calvinism, but still is relatively close in some ways. So they went back and they spread this religion. So in terms of the Catholic Church, what they realized was that they were losing bunches and bunches of people. So the Catholics responded to Protestant by trying to reform the Catholic Church from the inside. And this guy here is Ignatius Loyola. He's a Spanish noble, became a reformer, and started the Society of Jesus, which members were called the Jesuits. Now they were pretty much like the monks of Cluny in the Middle Ages. They taught people and set up schools and lived relatively simple lives in comparison to some of the rich nobles of the church. And they were successful in bringing many back into the Roman Catholic Church, places like Poland and some other areas as well, that were looking like they become Protestant. They became more and more Catholic after this. The Pope also set up a council at a place called Trent that ended the practices of things like the indulgence and that had been criticized in the past. The church leaders were ordered to follow strict rules and set up seminaries, which are places, schools that trained priests. Council of Trent also reinforced that good works and faith were needed both to get into heaven. So it made sure that everyone realized that, yes, you do need both those things. And these reforms helped to get many back into the Roman Catholic Church. Now in England, this is sort of the middle way. The difference being that originally they started off very Catholic, and then they chose their own way, but it wasn't directly related to Lutheranism or Calvinism. So if you look here, we got the Tudor family tree. This is after the War of the Roses and the Lancaster and York, and after they ended up resolving their problems, then it leads to the Tudor family taking over. We have Henry VII here, right up here, and then we have Henry VIII, and he married a bunch of women, and that led to a bunch of issues. So moving on here quickly. So the break with Rome, Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife Catherine and marry another woman, and who he thought would give him a son as an heir. This request was unusual, and the Pope was in a tough spot because he was basically surrounded by the leader of Spain, who was related to Catherine. When his request was refused, Henry decided, you know what, I'm going to get a divorce myself by setting up my own church, and this was called the Church of England, which is very similar to the Roman Catholic Church, but had the English monarchy as the head of it. Henry was excommunicated by the Pope, and this is kind of surprising in that he was viewed as very Roman Catholic before this, but obviously if you go ahead and form your own church, then that leads to other problems. Henry got married 6 times. His third wife, Jane Seymour, gave him a son that he was after, and but previously he'd had a daughter, Mary, with his first wife Catherine, and another daughter, Elizabeth, with his second wife Anne. And again, yes, Catherine the First was she was divorced, and then Anne was beheaded, and then Jane Seymour, she died, and then his other 3 wives, divorced, beheaded, survived. So now Henry took over the property of the Roman Catholic Church, and the British Parliament said anybody who did not believe the king was the leader of the church could be tried as a heretic. And as a matter of fact, this guy here, Sir Thomas More, he got into a lot of arguments, and he was a close advisor to the king until he made a stand against how his marriages should not be allowed, and then eventually he gets killed, even though at one point he was pretty close friends with Henry. Now Edward and Mary, when Henry VIII died, his son Edward took over, but he was still too young to lead, and died soon into his reign. Next in line of succession was Mary, who was Catholic, and when she took over, she tried to force people back, force the British, sometimes with violence, to become Catholic again. So you got this yo-yo back and forth, Catholic, non-Catholic, Catholic, Church of England, Catholic. And she was married to a Spanish king, and that was unpopular since most English people considered the Spanish as their enemies. Now Mary died without an heir, and her sister was the next person in line. And she was Protestant, so you go back to Church of England. She became queen, and she again entered the authority of the Pope in England. The church that she helped us to establish kept some Catholic features, and she ruled for many years. That really helped to establish the Church of England. Some people wanted to make the church more pure from the inside, and they were called the Puritans, and that is a group that a lot of them came to the United States, or it was to become the United States, settled places around Massachusetts, so that's why they are important. Now, there were a series of wars in terms of Catholic versus Protestant during this time period. In the middle of the 1500s, most Northern Europeans were Protestant, and most Southern Europeans were Catholics. The leaders of the country were the supporters of their religion. In fact, the two biggest ones were two biggest countries in terms of religious hatred for one another at one point were England and Spain. And Spain was a Catholic country, and England was a Protestant country. Philip knew that if he defeated England, then the Protestants would be in trouble, and Philip had large ships called galleons built. He then sent his armada to lead an attack, but the plan was that then the army would come over and they'd defeat the English and put the Catholic Church back in charge. Elizabeth knew the attack was coming, but she was prepared. She had her own fleet built, and that was smaller but better armed. And the English were able to break the strong formation of the Spanish ships, and able to take them on kind of one at a time, and able to defeat most of them, or a lot of them. The defeated Armada then made its way around England the entire way and around Ireland, and a lot of them went ahead and sank during a storm. And Spain and England after this were still enemies, but Spain was much weaker. Well, somewhat weaker, because they had all this money coming in from the new colonies in the New World. Now, in terms of the Huguenots, most of the French were Catholic, but many of the most educated were Protestant. Now, these Protestants were called Huguenots. They followed the beliefs of Calvin, and the king of the time was a king named Francis, and he prohibited the Huguenots from practicing. So a civil war breaks out, and eventually Francis dies, and Charles IX and his mother Catherine come in, and Charles is young, so he's not really in charge. It's more Catherine than anything. But they play the two groups, the Huguenots versus the Catholics, off one of another. So many Huguenots were killed after Catherine and Charles decided to support the Catholics, and some of them left, but some of them stayed behind, like Henry of Navarre, and stayed to fight. When Charles was killed, Henry was next in line to be the throne, but he went ahead and converted to Catholicism because he realized that most of the people in France were actually Catholic, and they wanted a Catholic leader. But he did sign something called the Edict of Nantes, which said that both groups were allowed to worship. In the Low Countries, this was an area around Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands. They were controlled by Spain, and that was, again, heavily Catholic. And there were a lot of Protestants in the area, but Philip wanted it to be all Catholic, so he sets up an inquisition to try and get rid of Protestantism. Fighting broke out, and eventually the northern part that became the Netherlands became Protestant, the southern part that became Belgium remained Catholic. The big war at the time is called the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, German leaders started to argue over the terms of the Peace of Augsburg. They broke down into Catholic and Protestant groups. The German Emperor Ferdinand led the Catholics, and he tried to get the province of Bohemia to become Catholic after it revolted. It was Protestant, so he tried to get them back in line. Protestant armies from Sweden and Denmark get involved, and they fight against the Catholic Germans. Now the Swedes, they were defeated, but then Roman Catholic France joins in the Protestant side and on the conflict, and it morphed into one that was mainly based on gaining territory and power instead of about religion. Eventually the German emperor lost a major battle and wanted peace. The different groups signed something called the Peace of Westphalia, and the German emperor became weaker, and this is for the Holy Roman Empire, and the French became stronger.